In the previous video, you saw how Martin Luther had called for the abolishment of the entire Roman liturgical calendar and all its feasts and festivals, including Christmas. And you also saw how he incited the Christmas riots in Wittenberg, to unsuccessfully force the German church to abandon the practice. You saw how the consensus, among the real original German Reformation, openly and clearly rejected the practice of Christmas, stated openly by both Martin Luther and Martin Bucer, including in Martin Luther's very own writings, which were being spread all across Protestant Europe. You also saw how the German church never fully implemented Luther's recommendations to abolish the liturgical calendar, including Christmas, and that after a lifetime of compromise on the subject, Luther finally acquiesced to the practice, erroneously believing in the Vatican's lie that it really had been the actual birthdate of Christ, which turned out to be a serious historical mistake on Luther's part. You also saw how the Counter-reformation in Germany undid most of what Luther had done, and began to intentionally misrepresent him, both to Lutherans and the world. And how the Counter-reformation continues to use disinformation concerning Martin Luther into our very own day, falsely claiming he invented Christmas trees, or the practice of lighting candles on them, because of his deep love for Christmas. The same Christmas he never endorsed, and only accepted as a simple annual memorial service, marking Christ's birth. Without the pagan solstice trees, drunken parties, or religious commercialism we now have today. In short, Martin Luther never endorsed our modern Christmas, nor the Christmas tree, which in reality is simply more Counter-reformation, non-historical propaganda. And that brings us to our second figure that is often cited by Counter-reformationists to continue the practice of Roman sun worship as Christ, and that is John Calvin. After telling the public that Martin Luther endorsed Christmas, it is claimed every year by Counter-reformationists, John Calvin taught Christmas was a non-issue. They claim Calvin was neither for nor against Christmas. But you have already seen their first claim that Martin Luther was for Christmas is only a half-truth. In fact, there was much more to the Martin Luther story than they ever tell the public. And Martin Luther was in fact openly on record against the practice. Luther's involvement with Christmas was only at best a defeated acquiescence of the practice toward the end of his life, based completely on the lie Christ had really actually been born on that date. And despite Luther having equated unvetted forms of worship with the worship of the devil, Luther died blind and deceived about Christmas. When it comes to what actually happened concerning John Calvin and Christmas, we will see a completely different problem. Not one which comes from being deceived about anything, but something entirely different that speaks more about John Calvin than it actually does Christmas. Most people do not realize, when they hear Counter-reformationists cite John Calvin as justification for their celebration of Christmas, they are actually much more accurately implicating John Calvin than they are exonerating the practice of Christmas. And you will see why in a few moments. Because John Calvin didn't actually exonerate Christmas. He actually preached against it. But he didn't just preach against it citing it as unbiblical, he went even further on record than just that. He actually called it satanic. And it was this public declaration which made its way into Puritan theology, which was made law in both England in the early Plymouth colonies, in America. But before we get to the Pilgrims, let's take a look at what really happened with John Calvin and Christmas. As you saw in the previous video, the Counter-reformation makes a habit out of intentionally misrepresenting the facts. Or in other words, intentionally lying to the public. It is a very odd philosophy that propagates the idea a religious view should be spread through the clever use of intentional deceit, but that is precisely what Christians are faced with when it comes to believing Counter-reformation sources concerning anything in history or biblical text. Counter-reformationists routinely simply rewrite and fabricate history the way they want it to be, without conscience, void of any factual basis. And if there are any facts at all in their claims, the facts are so intentionally distorted and exaggerated that what is ultimately reported by them becomes a complete fiction in the end. And to complicate matters even further, Aside from using intentional deceit as a tool for religious persuasion, they also advocate an epistemology based on complete irrationality, such as demonstrated in Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, which actually teaches its victims to practice self-deceit, despite what they see with their own eyes. And while this is a Jesuit Roman Catholic discipline, the same methodology is routinely used by virtually all counter-reformationists, Protestant or Catholic, which unfortunately renders them completely alienated from any concept of personal accountability for the open use of deceit. All of which, of course, runs completely counter to Christ and the Scriptures. You saw how they intentionally lie about Martin Luther and have been doing so for centuries. So when it comes to John Calvin, what do you think the Counter-Reformation does here? Do you think they suddenly tell the truth? Or do you think they will continue their pattern of intentional public deceit? Well, if you guessed they will continue their pattern of public deceit, you guessed correct. That is precisely what they do with the issue of John Calvin. If you listen to the Counter-Reformation, you will get the impression today that, like their fictitious Martin Luther, John Calvin happily celebrated their pagan lust-filled, religiously apostate, Christmas. As you see on your screen, this Counter-Reformation website, also identifying itself as a purveyor of apologetics, which is certainly appropriate, displays this page to the public, entitled, John Calvin on Christmas. It displays the iconic Christmas manger scene, and then lists a quote from one of John Calvin's commentaries on Luke chapter 2 verses 1 through 7 about the birth of Christ. It is presented without controversy or debate. This is John Calvin on Christmas, as the title suggests. The people who put up that web page are not stupid. If you click on the Resources tab, you will discover it is connected to a professional apologetics author by the name of John M. Frame, which shows a list of 15 publications. And you will see at the bottom of that page it is connected to a metro church in Orlando, Florida called University Presbyterian Church. Which of course it is not. It is a counter-reformationist church falsely bearing the label, Presbyterian. It could call itself anything, as it is really just a religious business. And its beliefs and practices have nothing to do with historic Presbyterians in the least. It's just a modern church business with pop culture marketing. But they would have you believe that John Calvin wrote that text while he was having his Christmas, just like they do. The only problem, of course, is that this presentation is a complete lie. And the people who put that up on the internet knew when they did it, they were lying to the public. But they did it anyway, because they are not particularly concerned about anything true. They simply want to build their customer base, just like they would if they were selling used cars, except there would probably be more honesty from a used car salesman, because he could be sued for his lying. And these scammers know their lying has no economic downside. But their false presentation concerning John Calvin is not the result of ignorance or error. It is simply another outright flagrant lie from a counter-reformationist religious source. A flagrant lie, told without the slightest bit of conscience. John Calvin preached through the Scriptures without regard to the Catholic ecclesiastical calendar. And he also wrote commentaries on every book in the Bible except Revelation. So lifting this text out of one of his commentaries and passing it off as a comment on Christmas, from John Calvin, is completely deceptive on every level. And the author of this site fully knows what they are doing. John Calvin had a lot to say about Christmas, but this text was not one of them, as you will see in a minute. And passing this text off as John Calvin's comments on Christmas is about as inexcusably deceitful as anything could possibly be. And while this site just tells a lie, without even an attempt at justifying it, other counter-reformationists at least attempt to claim their lie as true by appealing to two letters. On the next website, which is shown on your screen, you see the title, John Calvin's Christmas Observance. This author shows two letters which are offered to the public to prove John Calvin observed Christmas. The first letter is dated January 2, 1551. And the second letter is dated 1555. The author has highlighted the lines in the letter he says proves John Calvin observed Christmas. The first letter states, quote, "Besides, the abolition of the feast days here has given grievous offense to some of your people, and it is likely enough that much unpleasant talk has been circulating among you. I am pretty certain, also, that I get the credit of being the author of the whole matter, both among the malevolent and the ignorant. But as I can solemnly testify that it was accomplished without my knowledge, and without my desire, so I resolved from the first rather to weaken malice by silence, than be over-solicitous about my defense. Before I ever entered the city, there were no festivals but the Lord's Day. Those celebrated by you were approved of by the same public decree by which Farrell and I were expelled. And it was rather extorted by the tumultuous violence of the ungodly, than decreed according to the order of law. Since my recall, I have pursued the moderate course of keeping Christ's birthday as you are wont to do." End quote. The second letter states, quote, "Respecting ceremonies, because they are things indifferent, the churches have a certain latitude of diversity. And when one has well weighed the matter, it may be sometimes considered useful not to have too rigid a uniformity respecting them, in order to show that faith and Christianity do not consist in that. As to festival days, they were abolished at Geneva before I left France, though for the innovation I am personally irresponsible. For the rest, my writings bear witness to my sentiments on these points, for in them I declare that a church is not to be despised or condemned, because it observes more festival days than the others. From this recent abolition of feast days, here is what has resulted. Not a year has passed without some quarrel and bickering, because the people were divided, and to such a degree as to draw their swords." End quote. So according to counter-reformationists, those statements show John Calvin was observing Christmas, and he was doing so clearly as early as January of the year 1551. And that is all that is said about the letter. John Calvin was documentably observing Christmas in 1551. And these quotes from these two letters are cited on many counter-reformation sites, all over the internet. Here on your screen is another site, showing the same claim, citing the same letters. This one is quite dogmatically entitled, "Calvin's Letter Shows He Kept December 25th Christmas." Now if you didn't know anything about the subject of Calvin at all, that might be impressive. At least impressive enough to settle the question for you. If you wanted to look no further, John Calvin kept Christmas. It settles it. End of story. But as you are finding out in this series, there is a lot more they have been hiding about all this in history, and the claims concerning these letters are as outright deceptive as those showing Martin Luther singing to a pagan German Christmas tree. So what are they hiding this time, and what are they simply lying about, concerning John Calvin and Christmas? Well, they have not been any more forthright and honest about those letters from John Calvin than they were about Martin Luther. Did John Calvin preach at Christmas in 1551? Yes, actually, he did. And we even have the text of the sermon he preached. But as you are about to see, what they are calling John Calvin celebrating Christmas is a far cry from what they have depicted. John Calvin's first letter, which they claim proves Calvin was celebrating Christmas, is dated January 2nd, 1551, as you can see on the historical timeline on your screen. What you are about to hear is John Calvin's Christmas sermon in December of that very year, 12 months later. Here is John Calvin celebrating Christmas, 12 months later, in December of that very same year, 1551.
Now, I see here today more people than I'm accustomed to having at the sermon. Why is that? It is Christmas Day. I told you this? You poor beasts. This is a fitting euphemism for all you who have come here today to honor Noel. Did you think you would be honoring God? Consider what sort of obedience to God your coming displays. In your mind, you are celebrating a holiday for God, or turning today into one, but so much for that. In truth, as you have often been admonished, it is good to set aside one day out of the year in which we were reminded of all the good that has occurred because of Christ's birth in the world, in which we hear the story of his birth retold, which will be done Sunday. But if you think that Jesus Christ was born today, you are as crazed as wild beasts. For when you elevate one day alone for the purpose of worshiping God, you have turned it into an idol. True, you insist that you have done so for the honor of God, but it is more for the honor of the devil. Let us consider what our Lord has to say on that matter. Was it not Saul's intention to worship God when he spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, along with the best spoils and cattle? He says as much, I want to worship God. Saul's tongue was full of devotion and good intention, but what was the response he received? You soothsayer, you heretic, you apostate, you claim to be honoring God, but God rejects you and disavows all that you have done. Consequently, the same is true of our actions. For no day is superior to another. It matters not whether we recall our Lord's nativity on a Wednesday, Thursday, or some other day. But when we insist on establishing a service of worship based on our whim, we blaspheme God and create an idol, though we have done it all in the name of God. And when you worship God in the idleness of a holiday spirit that is heavy sin to bear, and one which attracts others about it until we reach the height of iniquity. Therefore, let us pay attention to what Micah is saying here, that God must not only strip away things that are bad in themselves, but also eliminate anything that might foster superstition. Once we have understood that, we will no longer find it strange that Noel is not being observed today. But on Sunday we will celebrate the Lord's Supper and recite the Nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ. But all those who barely know Jesus Christ, or that we must be subject to Him, and that God removes all those impediments that would prevent us from coming to Him, these folks, I say, will at best grit their teeth. They came here in anticipation of celebrating a wrong intention, but will leave with it wholly unfulfilled.
As you can see for yourself from John Calvin's sermon text in 1551, John Calvin was not celebrating Christmas as is claimed. He did preach on December 25th. But the sermon was a public denunciation of the practice. And remember, this is during the same time frame that counter-reformationists claim, because of the statements in those two letters, that he was celebrating Christmas. Citing the phrase, quote, I have pursued the moderate course of keeping Christ's birthday as you are wont to do. End quote. But there is much more to those two letters than they are telling the public, which we will get into in just a moment. Here, however, we are showing Calvin's own sermon in 1551, what they are calling, quote, celebrating Christmas. There is a clear contradiction between the public claims they are making, and Calvin's own words, and his own sermon, in that very year's Christmas. In fact, John Calvin went even further on the subject than Martin Luther did. Although Luther incited the Christmas riots to have the practice shut down in Wittenberg, Luther acknowledged in his sermon texts that he thought Christ really had been born on December 25th. And later in his life, this faulty and erroneous belief led him to accommodate church services focused on the date as the Nativity Day of Christ, which historically proved to be a very serious mistake for Martin Luther, and in part led to the entire collapse of the German Reformation. This, however, was not the problem for John Calvin. He openly denounced the arbitrary selection of that day by the Vatican as the day of Christ's birth, stating if you believe that Christ was born on that day, you are as crazed as wild beasts. He was under no delusion when it came to the false nature of that nativity claim. And he made a point of stating when you create worship practices based on your own whims, rather than what had been instructed, it was a form of blasphemy against God. You cannot honor God by openly disobeying Him. It is a contradiction in terms. He also stated that arbitrarily making December 25th a holy day was simply idolatry, and that the entire practice was done in honor of the devil, not God, who commanded no such thing. Thus the act itself was disobedience to God, not something that in any way honored Him. In summary, John Calvin, on December 25th of 1551, in his public sermon, stated Christmas was a lie, and that it was blasphemy, idolatry, and satanic. But that's not all that John Calvin had to say about Christmas. He also said this. In 1544, John Calvin published a tract entitled, The Necessity of Reforming the Church. It was presented in public to the Imperial Diet of Speyer. The title, Imperial Diet, refers to the highest representative assembly in the empire. and this was his public testimony to the highest authorities in the Roman Empire on the subject of Christmas. Quote, "I know how difficult it is to persuade the world that God disapproves of all modes of worship not expressly sanctioned by his word. The opposite persuasion which cleaves to them, being seated, as it were, in their very bones and marrow, is, that whatever they do has in itself a sufficient sanction, provided it exhibits some kind of zeal for the honor of God. But since God not only regards as frivolous, but also plainly abominates, whatever we undertake from zeal to his worship, if at variance with his command, what do we gain by a contrary course? The words of God are clear and distinct, obedience is better than sacrifice. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 22. Matthew chapter 15 verse 9. Every addition of his word, especially in this matter, is a lie. Mere will worship is vanity. Colossians chapter 2 verse 23. This is the decision, and when once the judge has decided, it is no longer time to debate. End quote. He also made it quite clear to the authorities that publicly rebuking these practices was not optional. He states in the same publication, quote, "The mockery which worships God with naught but external gestures and absurd human fictions, how could we, without sin, allow to pass unrebuked? We know how much he hates hypocrisy, and yet in that fictitious worship, which was everywhere in use, hypocrisy reigned. We hear how bitter the terms in which the prophets inveigh against all worship fabricated by human rashness. But a good intention, or an insane license of daring whatever man pleased, was deemed the perfection of worship. For it is certain that in the whole body of worship which had been established, there was scarcely a single observance which had an authoritative sanction from the word of God. We are not in this matter to stand either by our own or by other men's judgments. We must listen to the voice of God, and hear in what estimation he holds that profanation of worship which is displayed when men, overleaping the boundaries of his word, run riot in their own inventions. The reasons which he assigns for punishing the Israelites with blindness, after they had lost the pious and holy discipline of the church, are 2, the prevalence of hypocrisy, and will worship, meaning thereby a form of worship contrived by man. Forasmuch, says he, as the people draw near me with their mouth, and with the lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me." End quote. So we have, once again, an irreconcilable contradiction between what counter-reformationists claim happened historically, and the actual facts from history. And we have 2 different contradictory sets of information. His actual words on the subject, and these 2 paragraphs from 2 private letters. So which is true? Which should be given precedent? Or how can these 2 opposite things be reconciled in their historical context, so that we can know the truth about them? And about John Calvin. One thing is certain, no matter what is stated in the paragraphs of those 2 letters, John Calvin publicly was denouncing the practice of Christmas, both from the pulpit and in his own published writings to the highest authorities in the land. During the very same time frame, counter-reformationists claim he was openly and consistently celebrating Christmas. So those 2 facts cannot coexist. But, what is clear however, is that counter-reformationists are once again attempting to hide the real history of what happened concerning the Reformation and Christmas. And here, their claims are patently false concerning John Calvin, even if you take every word from the 2 letters completely at face value. John Calvin was not celebrating or observing Christmas, because he says so point blank in his own sermon in that very same year. So what was really going on between his public statements and these 2 letters? No matter what you think about Christmas or John Calvin, factually, there are only 3 possibilities concerning these 2 lines from these 2 letters. 1. The first possibility was that he never actually wrote those words. The letter is simply a document fraud. Or perhaps the text was interpolated into a pre-existing letter, and then publicized after his death to deceive people. Meaning Calvin never really actually said such a contradictory thing to his own public words. The Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Church had been creating fraudulent historical documents for centuries, and so this would not be the first time it ever happened. In fact, much of the document fraud of the Catholic Church was never uncovered for centuries, until just recently, when much of the fraud was actually openly admitted by the Vatican, which they now label as pious fraud. as though document fraud is ever pious. The Counter-Reformation has been writing its own fraudulent history for centuries, and document fraud is clearly not beyond possibility concerning these two letters. And you will find out why, in just a moment. 2. The second realistic possibility is that John Calvin's statements are indeed precisely as the Counter-Reformation has depicted them. But let's consider what that option actually means. We already know that it did not mean, as they claim, he was celebrating Christmas. Because he wasn't. These letters are presented to Presbyterians, who venerate Calvin, to depict Calvin as an observer of Christmas, which they are now promoting. Which is a patently false claim. What it would mean, however, if it were true as presented, is that John Calvin had been a private hypocrite, saying one thing in public to the highest authorities in the land, and another thing completely opposite privately, when no one was around to hear it. So there would be no point in venerating him any longer, if that were true. He was a fraud. And there certainly would be no point in following his advice on Christmas, no matter what it was. Because he was a complete fraud, plain and simple. And you probably shouldn't be a Presbyterian or a Calvinist any longer. If that is the case. Far from exonerating the practice of Christmas, these letters would actually condemn the conduct of Calvin as a secret hypocrite. 3. And the only other third possibility that exists is that the Counter-Reformation has contorted and twisted the words of the text in these letters beyond the point of recognition. And they have twisted the text of these letters in a completely misleading and deceptive way to intentionally lead people to false conclusions, both about John Calvin and Christmas. And those are the only three possibilities that you have. John Calvin simply celebrating Christmas and stating so in a letter, however, is not one of these options, because we know, factually, John Calvin did not do that, and we have his other sermon texts and published writings to the contrary. And you cannot simply erase this known and documented history just because you feel like it, with 2 lines from a letter. So you have 3 realistic possibilities, none of which, however, honestly or realistically, include the presentation given by Christmas promoting Counter-Reformationists that John Calvin was simply and forthrightly observing Christmas, and mentioned it in a letter. Either John Calvin never wrote those words to begin with, or John Calvin was a pretty despicable hypocrite and impostor as a reformer, or these comments have been used as simply part of a false presentation to intentionally deceive people. But there are no other options. So now let's look at each of these possibilities and see which one is most likely the culprit. As we mentioned in the previous section, there are only 3 possible explanations for the texts from the 2 letters from Calvin, which are cited by Counter-Reformationists to promote Christmas. Either the texts in the letters are a fraud, or John Calvin himself, as a reformer, was a fraud, or the presentation of these texts from the letters by Counter-Reformationists is a fraud. But 2 things are undeniably certain when it comes to the claims made, based on the 2 references from these 2 private letters. There is definitely the presence of fraud somewhere. It has already been demonstrated that the Counter-Reformationists claim that John Calvin was openly and forthrightly celebrating Christmas is a fraudulent claim. That is demonstrated by the text of John Calvin's sermon in the very year of the first letter. But how are the existence of these 2 texts themselves explained? On that question, once again, there is no other possibility available than fraud. But the source of the fraud could be the text themselves, or John Calvin's personhood himself, or the presentation of what the texts actually really are saying. But regardless of which option you pick, one thing is still certain, and that is that the citation of the texts themselves point to some kind of fraud. The only question is, who, or what, is the source of it? Given there are only 3 possible answers, you have to ask yourself as an historical researcher, what is the most likely or probable source? Because there are only 3. But before we begin answering that question, regardless of what may be the most probable explanation for the 2 texts in those 2 letters, something needs to be pointed out first concerning the contradiction these letters pose. And that is perspective. There is no field of study in existence which does not occasionally face a contradiction. In fields of study, occasional contradictions are never used to define the entire understanding of what is consistent. In fact, the exact reverse is always done. In medical research, in a study of 100 people, 98 people might be helped by a drug. 2 people, however, might get sick. The conclusion of the research does not state, therefore, the drug makes people sick. The overwhelming consistent result is that the drug makes the vast majority of people better. Not the other way around. In geological or archaeological research, there may be 100 objects in a layer of dirt, which all date back to 500 AD. But there may be 2 objects in that strata that are found to be only 50 years old. No one ever concludes, therefore, that the strata of soil, and all the objects found within it, are therefore only 50 years old. In law, there may be 50 facts of conclusive evidence that show a man is innocent. But 2 facts contradict the preponderance of evidence. No conscientious lawyer would ever advise a jury to simply ignore the entire preponderance of evidence, and instead, make their decision based on 2 pieces of circumstantial evidence. They would do precisely the opposite. So, the point is, no matter what the explanation is for these 2 texts, or even if there is no explanation at all, 2 paragraphs from 2 private letters on their own, is not even close to being able to honestly conclude a contrary opinion to all the rest of the known information concerning John Calvin and Christmas. But the key word there is honestly. And as you know, honesty is not something that counter-reformationists ever value when it comes to promoting their religious beliefs. They value deception over honesty on a daily basis. So it cannot be expected of them to ever exercise any honest conclusions, including concerning the reformer John Calvin and his practices and teachings concerning Christmas. If a lie can be credibly told by counter-reformationists, you can predictably count on them to simply lie, rather than deal with the facts. But as you see from all other fields of knowledge and study and research, no one honest ever takes the anomaly, or the exception, or the contradiction, instead of the rule, as the definition of what is true. No one, in any field of study on earth, except by counter-reformationists in the subject of religion. Because their religion itself is not true. And they know without their deception, it will cease to exist. And that is an unacceptable reality to counter-reformationists. So they choose instead to simply and intentionally lie. But that is what you need to remember next time you see these 2 texts cited by a counter-reformationist on the internet to claim John Calvin either approved of Christmas or claimed it didn't matter. You are seeing someone use an isolated anomaly to claim something is a rule, in contradiction to the whole body of fact. And it is no different than claiming a medicine is safe or harmful because of 2 people out of 100. That approach in medicine would be called malpractice, and somebody would risk even going to jail over such claims. So do not buy that argument from counter-reformationists, no matter what the explanation turns out to be for those 2 isolated references. They are the exception, and not the rule, of literature and history concerning John Calvin and Christmas. And the sad thing about this is that most educated counter-reformationists who are promoting that claim already know how completely dishonest that claim actually is. So before we even begin, let's put these 2 references back into an honest perspective, and not fail to make the point that in any field of study, no matter what it is, exceptions and anomalies do not make the rule. So do not let counter-reformationists get away with that. It is nothing more than another dishonest dirty trick from counter-reformationist religious leaders. Even if you know nothing else about this subject, do not let them take an exception and make a rule. Now let's look at the 3 possible explanations and see which one is most probable. The first possibility that must be considered when looking at these 2 texts, in contradiction to the whole body of both documented history and public literature concerning John Calvin, is the possibility that they may have been fraudulently produced. Not that the entire letters are fraudulent, but that the section of text which is being cited was interpolated into the letter, and then reproduced as the original letter. This is not simply a generic possibility, but as you will see in a moment, there is good reason to hold this position as a highly probable one. Document fraud is an ancient practice which has a very long history, and it is an especially prominent and frequent activity among Counter-reformation sources. Their openly accepted practice of deception gives them ample incentive to apply their utilitarian philosophy of religious deceit to virtually everything they touch. And with this deceit they have often been rewarded with the reshaping of history in Western civilization. Simply because people were not either skeptical enough or courageous enough to call out their fraud. Not only were single documents forged, such as the donation of Constantine, which by the way, changed the entire history of Europe, but entire series of writings were forged, such as the Clementine letters which amounted to 20 books allegedly written by one of Rome's first popes. But however, were completely fabricated, with the possible exception of only a single letter to some people in the city of Corinth. The donation of Constantine was a fraudulent document published under the guise of a legal grant by Emperor Constantine in which he is recorded as having granted the entire Roman Empire, all of its kingdoms and lands, legally, to the Catholic Church. Which actually never happened. Despite this fact, however, the Vatican cited this legal document to hold Europe's kings hostage for well over 1,000 years, anyway. All along knowing the document was actually a complete fraud. As you recall previously, concerning the Bishop of Constantinople, when it comes to the Reformation, not only were fraudulent documents produced, but even legitimate documents were claimed to be fraudulent, in order to nullify them. So the document forgery wars, with the Vatican, were in full bloom during this time. There are 3 reasons it is entirely reasonable to remain skeptical about the Counter-reformationists' claims, based on these 2 letters, that have to do with the subject of document fraud. Those 3 reasons are: the paragraphs from these 2 letters lack 1. Document consistency, 2. They lack historical continuity, and 3. They are out of character. If you study the techniques used for uncovering document fraud, you will find that most of them will focus on details found within the original manuscript document. In the case of John Calvin's 2 private letters, however, the original manuscripts are not available to the general public, and they were not written in English. So what we have are translations from copies. That means that we are 3 manuscript generations and 2 languages away from what Calvin himself actually wrote. And the possession of these documents are held in ownership by Counter-Reformation historical sources. Since we don't have access to scrutiny of the original manuscripts, we are left with only techniques that use internal consistency and external indicators of fraud, not critiques of the original documents. Despite this limitation, there are, however, immediately, some major red flags. And these are ways modern investigators and ancient historians spot actual document frauds. To put it simply, some things concerning the presentation of these texts do not add up the way they should, if in fact, they were authentic. Any one of these fraud indicators may exist with a real document, but when they are all found together, it suggests the document in question is unlikely to be a legitimate and authentic composition. Authentic compositions do not occur in a vacuum. They are surrounded by other texts which serve as their context. Between the previous statements and the ones that follow, there are transitional statements. And the texts themselves reflect or echo, not only other internal passages, but the whole body of writing by the author, the historical context of the author and the text, and the personality characteristics, ideologies and/or psychological traits of the author, along with modes of literary expression. These tools are all used in textual criticism, even when studying documents found within the Bible. So an odd text, allegedly written by John Calvin, should be no exception to these standards. The first indicator of document fraud we will examine is known as document consistency. Document consistency is listed as an indicator, still even today, in the modern investigation of document fraud. When a document is forged, it is usually done so in order to change a known documented status quo. So its existence creates an anomaly that stands alone on its own. It is a deviation, or an oddity, an outlier, among everything else that is present both within the document itself and in other documents, which can be compared to it. The house was really left to Aunt Sally in the will, despite all the documentation to the contrary. The person really lives in Virginia, not California, despite records of the person in California. The famous person was really for some cause, not against, despite everything else they said and did. So the document fraud is, by necessity of the fraud, an outlier. It stands in open contradiction with other known documentation, in which both cannot be true at the same time. And that certainly is the case with the presentation of these two texts, from these two private letters. The texts as they are presented by counter-reformationists run opposite to everything John Calvin is known to have preached, published and practiced. So they are outliers and contradictions. And that is the first major red flag. But evidence that document inconsistency has occurred here runs much deeper than just that these two statements, as they are presented by counter-reformationists, contradict everything Calvin is known to have preached, published and practiced. They even contradict internal points preceding and following the comments within the letters themselves. If you are reading a letter from someone, and out of nowhere, they mention they like ice cream, you might not think anything unusual of the comment. However, if following the text they say, quote, "just like you see in my picture on my desk," end quote, that is an appeal to an external confirmation. But what if the picture they had on their desk was a picture of the author vomiting? Suddenly, the text is either understood by the reader as meaning a complete opposite of what is stated, or it was a mistake by someone not familiar with the details. There are only two possibilities with such a contradictory external reference. The same exact thing happens with these two texts, in these two letters. John Calvin allegedly makes the statement he has no convictions or preferences concerning Christmas, but then in the very same letter, he appeals to his published writings on the matter. The only problem is that anyone actually familiar with his published writings knows he categorically denounces all Roman feast days and festivals. All of them. Not just Christmas, but every single one of them, altogether. So that external reference is completely inconsistent with the very sentences that Counter-Reformation is claiming proves Calvin observed Christmas. It is a document inconsistency. So we are looking at the presence of both internal and external document inconsistency. And the fact that both exist simultaneously is a major red flag in the investigation of document fraud. But not only is there obvious document inconsistency, both internally and externally, present with these two quotes, you also have the presence of another second major indicator of fraud, which is a lack of contemporary continuity. If, for example, you are reading a letter that is dated May 1st, 1912, and the letter claims in passing that they stopped by the port in New York to see the Titanic arrive on April 16th, in order to greet the arrival of their cousin from England, you immediately realize something does not add up. Because that never happened. And anyone really living, at that time back then, would have known that never happened. So a reference to that event would cast an obvious suspicion on such a letter. So the lack of historic continuity is an important indicator, and we have precisely that with these quotes. In the first letter, Calvin allegedly makes a reference to quote, "Since my recall, I have pursued the moderate course of keeping Christ's birthday as you are wont to do." End quote. But we know from his own sermon in that very same year, that is precisely not what Calvin did historically. Why would Calvin appeal to something that both he and the person he was writing to know did not happen? That is like appealing to the arrival of the Titanic in New York. There is clearly an obvious lack of historic continuity present. And that is another major red flag indicating fraud. The third indicator of fraud is found in the fact that the quotes, as they are presented by counter-reformationists, is out of character. To understand the oddness of the two anomalous texts from these two private letters, you would have to put these circumstances into the present era with a known public figure, which John Calvin was. For example, another reformer who lived in modern times was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. His grandfather named Martin Luther King Sr. after the reformer, Martin Luther. Martin Luther King Jr. was a public figure, just like John Calvin was in his day. They both lived lives in the public view, and everyone in both their days were familiar with their life's work and what they publicly stood for. So, what would you think, if after Martin Luther King Jr. died, a representative from a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan appeared on TV alleging they had 2 secret private letters written to them by Martin Luther King Jr., claiming that he too secretly agreed with them? Would you believe that? Would that claim have any credibility with you today? Or would you immediately suspect that document fraud and deception was probably at work? Your first reaction, which would be completely reasonable, would be to suspect that document fraud was probably at work, with no further information necessary. Why is that? Because the claimed letter would be completely counter to everything Martin Luther King Jr. had worked for and stood for publicly, and even risked his life to promote. And he would have never written such a letter to his adversaries, with such a statement. And the same is true of John Calvin. The people allegedly addressed in these letters were not for the reformations in the church which eliminated the very same Christmas Calvin was publicly denouncing from his own pulpit. They were John Calvin's adversaries during the Reformation. And you would also know, the people offering the document certainly would have had both the motivation and ethical behavior consistent with offering a fraudulent document to undermine his work. And yet, that is precisely what you are seeing with these 2 letters concerning John Calvin. The statements offered from these 2 letters, the way they are offered, run counter to everything Calvin both preached and published, and ever practiced. And in essence his life's work as a reformer. Yet counter-reformationists wish you to take their word for it, without question or skepticism, that Calvin actually personally wrote such a thing, completely contrary to everything he said and did as a person. Denouncing his own life's work? So there is certainly cause to hold them within a reasonable skepticism, even on face value, and with no more information than simply that. And that's not all. It gets even worse from here. If the texts in these letters existed in Calvin's time, as they have been presented since his time, why were they not known during his life? The first letter was allegedly written in January of 1551 AD. And then 12 months later, we have the text of John Calvin's sermon, obviously completely inconsistent with this letter he allegedly wrote just 12 months earlier. If this letter had been known about in Calvin's time, it would have been a very simple matter for someone to have confronted him with his own writings on Christmas, and openly call him a blathering hypocrite. But no one did. Why? Why was this letter not produced by the ruler who had received it to quell the controversy created by his sermon? It would have been entirely logical and even necessary to do so, yet there was no such letter ever produced. And it was nowhere to be found. You have to consider the actual claims made with these 2 texts from these 2 letters themselves. Obviously, if Calvin actually wrote this material the way it is presented, then we have to admit the facts which they cite as well to have been realities. Let's go over those actual claims. In these texts, as they are presented, John Calvin claims, first, that he is keeping Christmas, which he obviously did not do, and states so in the very sermon he gives. Secondly, the Counter-Reformation claims from these 2 texts, he personally did not want Christmas stopped, which John Calvin obviously contradicts, claiming the exact opposite in his public sermons and published writings. And thirdly, he allegedly states that there is so much conflict and controversy over it, he doesn't want to talk about it, which he obviously did, and even publicly. So there are some serious contradictions, or as investigators say, some serious inconsistencies here. Both of those letters were never produced publicly during his lifetime to the public during the middle of these controversies. And this is a major red flag. The second major red flag is that these 2 alleged textual comments run counter to everything he actually said and did publicly, which he actually appeals to in the very same letter. And the third major red flag in terms of document fraud is that these are documents which were produced by the Counter-Reformation back in the 1700s, and their use today is no different than how they were used previously centuries ago. These documents could have been easily produced and circulated during Calvin's own lifetime, during the middle of his own sermons, yet no one did. And the only reasonable explanation for that absence, especially when they claim there was physical violence present and people were either dying over it, or at least at risk of dying over it as a result of violence, was for these rulers to produce these letters publicly and rebuke John Calvin for his hypocrisy on the matter. Yet no one ever did. And it never happened. Why is that? because they didn't exist at the time. So how does the Counter-Reformation explain these historical discrepancies? They don't. And they never have. If this had happened today, it is very likely that those texts from those letters would have never been accepted as having been authenticated historical documents. But back in the Middle Ages, if a king declared a document to be real, anyone questioning his claim would have been executed for sedition. The situation today, however, is quite different. Today, people would very easily conclude with good reason such a circumstance to be suspicious. And most would probably remain skeptical of such claim statements, allegedly given in 2 private letters, contrary to everything else known publicly. As you have now already seen, there is more than enough evidence to remain skeptical of those quotes. But even if you simply ignore everything presented so far, you are still left with one last outstanding enigma that no one can explain. If it is true that John Calvin had really believed those things as stated in those 2 quotes, and if John Calvin really said those things privately in those 2 letters, then there would have been no reason on earth he would not have openly voiced them, precisely that way, to his own congregation and his own sermons. Especially since those opinions were the easiest and most socially and financially rewarding to speak publicly at the time. So there would have been no motivation whatsoever for Calvin not to have voiced those same opinions publicly, which he did not. It is far more likely, even today, that the exact opposite would be true. It is far more likely that a minister might publicly endorse Christmas, but then privately admit some misgivings about it. Not the other way around. Because going along to get along is a much bigger incentive on the part of being quiet about Christmas than there is to publicly objecting to it. Still, even today, do you see anyone today publicly denouncing Christmas and then privately admitting it's no big deal? Hardly. The situation is quite reversed for the very same reasons today that existed in John Calvin's time. So John Calvin's own public sermons and published words and public practices are not consistent with the claims made from these 2 paragraphs from these 2 letters. And it is very hard to explain their absence during his own lifetime when he himself was creating such a controversy. It is more than obvious they would have been very readily and easily produced to squelch the insults, violence and protests over that issue. Yet there is no explanation for any of these factual realities. Therefore, because of all of the previous reasons cited, it is a perfectly reasonable position to remain skeptical of their historical authenticity. 1. They contradict Calvin's own public practices, published literature, and public sermons. 2. There is no explanation as to why they were not publicly produced during Calvin's lifetime to refute him. 3. There is no motivation for him having not publicly voiced that opinion himself, especially when it was the exact opinion his own overseers, rulers and congregations would have preferred to hear, to begin with. Yet, the Counter-Reformation can give no reasonable or credible explanation for these 3 simultaneous facts. Assuming the texts as they are presented were actually what Calvin had written, against his own behavior and teachings. But now let's look at the second possibility. Let's assume they are completely authentic, let's ignore their document inconsistency, let's ignore the lack of historical continuity, and let's ignore the fact they are completely out of character. Let's simply take the claims of Counter-Reformationists completely at face value, and let's examine what that would say about John Calvin, rather than Christmas. Possibility number 2, that John Calvin was a fraud, is an important point and one that has to be acknowledged. People who do not like John Calvin would need nothing more than the title for this one. And people who do like John Calvin probably would not care how much evidence there would be to demonstrate he was a fraud, as a reformer. They would still like him despite the facts to the contrary. So there is very little religious objectivity out there in the world concerning John Calvin. And the point in this section will not be to prove that he might have been a fraud as a reformer. In fact, it is to show precisely the opposite with respect to the subject of Christmas. But, these 2 paragraph quotes are being produced to persuade people in public religious demographic segments that venerate John Calvin as part of their theological heritage. and they are being produced to show that their particular religious founder was either indifferent toward Christmas, or actually practiced Christmas, and therefore indirectly approved of the modern counter-reformationist clergy in their midst, who are spreading imperial Roman Empire sun worship among modern Protestant Christians. The same Protestant Christians who generally have absolutely no clue that is what they are up to. So, what this section will focus on is why you should reject, and when appropriate, expose that effort for what it is. Their quotes, if absolutely taken at face value, do not exonerate the practice of Christmas. They do not even show that the Reformation as a consensus was for Christmas at all. In fact, they do precisely the opposite. There are 3 points under this section which will be noted, and they are as follows. 1. The quotes, as they are presented by counter-reformationists, are self-defeating. 2. The quotes admit, the ban on Christmas was the result of the Reformation in total and was the consensus. 3. If true, they mean John Calvin was an opportunistic fraud, and a public con artist. First, let's examine the fact that the claims based on these 2 quotes are self-nullifying or self-defeating claims. The 2 quotes, used by counter-reformationists concerning Christmas, hardly exonerate Christmas, using John Calvin as their source. What they would do, however, is call John Calvin an open public liar. And not only a liar, but a complete fraud, as a reformer. They attempt to explain away John Calvin's public statements concerning Christmas, as simply adopting the popular opinion of the time, but privately admitting he held no such convictions. Thus in essence falsely depicting himself with these opinions, when in reality, he had none, and even personally believed the contrary. But if you accept their explanation, the conclusion you would be forced into, if you accepted their claim, is that John Calvin was actually a public fraud. Which is not at all what they are attempting to do, by citing those quotes. Because in many cases, if not most, those quotes are presented by counter-reformationist clergy, in Presbyterian or Calvinistic theological circles, to persuade them to endorse Christmas. So that is not at all what they are actually attempting to do. Yet, that is precisely what that information would really mean, if it were truthful. Why? Because you cannot cherry-pick the consequence you want, and ignore the consequence you don't. They both must be accepted equally, because they are both the logical conclusion of the same set of information. If ice is frozen water, then it also means it is cold. You cannot have one truth, without the other. Both would be equally true at the same time, based on the same set of facts. And that is precisely what they are facing, when they claim John Calvin wrote those comments, as they present them to the public. If ice is frozen water, then it also means it's cold. If John Calvin actually wrote those texts, the way they have presented them, then he would also be a fraud. As the old saying goes, you can't have your cake, and eat it too. As in this case, you can't have your quotes, and not call John Calvin a complete fraud, at the same time. So the quotes do not accomplish what counter-reformationists present them as accomplishing. They are self-defeating. If they are true, they prove Calvin was a fraud and would say anything despite his convictions. So there would be no point in citing him on anything. Secondly, John Calvin admits he was not the author of the ban on Christmas in Geneva. It was banned before he ever got there. This is a huge admission. It is true historically that Christmas had already been dropped before John Calvin got to Geneva. But counter-reformationists conveniently quickly skip over the significance of that fact, in their speed to disassociate Calvin with rejecting Christmas. Do not ever let them do that to you, in a conversation. The reason is that this admission is much bigger than Calvin's alleged private ambiguity or endorsement of Christmas. That is where you should park the car, and take the keys with you. Because what that very first point in his letter demonstrates, is that it was the consensus of the Reformation, before Calvin is ever introduced into the picture. And the reason it was the consensus to begin with, is because the Reformation was attempting to return to a biblical Christianity. And everyone could simply plainly see, Christmas was unbiblical. They did not need a John Calvin to give them permission to see that. It was already a grassroots observation among biblically literate clergy throughout the Reformation in Europe. And that point should be where everything begins, in this discussion. And as you saw in the earlier video, this was precisely the same conclusion Martin Luther came to as well. Not only did Luther never endorse the practice of Christmas, he had openly denounced the practice, both in his sermons and in written publications. He too reflected the very same consensus which had spread throughout Protestant Europe. And the first point in Calvin's letter which they cite is that this was indeed the case, even in Geneva. That first point is exactly and precisely what Counter-reformationists are attempting to snuff out with their presentation of these quotes. But it begins with the very premise that their rewrite of history is fraudulent. Calvin or not, it was the consensus of Reformation Europe. So that means, simply put, John Calvin was on board with that consensus, or he lied about it publicly and was not an authentic or genuine part of the real Reformation in Europe. Calvin's opinion is reduced to a moot point. And that brings us to point number 3. Given that the consensus of the Reformation was to drop Christmas, then that means, unavoidably, 2. John Calvin's public false pretense to go along with this conclusion would have been an act of public fraud. Since it was the consensus of Reformation Europe that Christmas was satanic, which Calvin openly voiced from his own pulpit, what would that say about John Calvin, being secretly ambivalent about something satanic, and claiming privately to his adversaries against reform, he didn't care one way or another, even if it was satanic, as he had stated himself publicly? There was no other conclusion any honest person could reach, other than John Calvin must have been an imposture reformer. A fake. Someone who told people whatever he thought they wanted to hear, whenever he was in front of them. And his reformer views were nothing more than the insincere adaptation of popular opinion to seize the opportunity. Because that is precisely what Counter-reformationist sources are attempting to claim about John Calvin. And if John Calvin was such a fraud as this, why would you ever care what he said about anything, much less Christmas? So the Counter-reformationist has painted himself into a corner, and he has no way out of his own predicament when it comes to John Calvin and these quotes. If the quotes are true and accurate as the Counter-reformationist has depicted, then Calvin was a self-confessed fraud, not a reformer. In fact, he wasn't even a legitimate leader in the movement. He was a deluded opportunistic compromiser, and nothing more than a common fraud. End of story. But people that have studied John Calvin, both from his proponents to his critics, find him historically to have been precisely opposite of that in history. So the probabilities for this particular scenario, being the explanation for the source of fraud, are very unlikely. And if you are someone among the religious demographics that venerate John Calvin as a reformer, then Counter-reformationists are doing quite a disservice to you and to John Calvin. They turn him into a common opportunist and a fraud with their own claims to defend their Vatican Christmas. Which of course they would happily do, because Christmas is more important to them than anything Christ said or that is found in the Bible. So therefore, they would certainly have no problem throwing the corpses of John Calvin or Martin Luther under the bus to defend it, since they already have no problem trampling Christ himself underfoot. The third and last possible source of the fraud observed in the Calvin letters claim is both the simplest explanation and the one that meets all of the historical data criteria presented by the historical contradictions that these claims pose. It explains why the letters may have indeed existed, but also explains why they were never produced to refute John Calvin's public statements concerning Christmas. And it explains why the texts which are cited are so contradicted, both by preceding and following statements in the letters themselves, and by external documentation and history. And it is the only explanation of the three which can account for all the information we have. It was one of the earliest public refutations we have on record, after Calvin's lifetime, when the letters were made public and used by Anglo-Catholics in the Counter-Reformation in England, to make their arguments for keeping the Roman Christ Mass, against the original confessions and practices of the Reformed Presbyterians. in the year 1637, as these letters were being dragged out of the closet to undermine and corrupt the Reformed Presbyterian churches in Scotland. A Reformed Presbyterian theologian and scholar by the name of George Gillespie issued a written public rebuttal. Gillespie was the youngest member of the Westminster Assembly and participated in the composition of the Westminster Confession of Faith. His reputation was so complete that counter-reformationists dropped their arguments using these letters for centuries, until just recently, when they were reintroduced to the public for precisely the same reason, to a much more naive public, to claim Calvin did Christmas. Only today, our modern Presbyterians have, without their knowledge, been overrun by counter-reformation theology decades ago, and have a great deal of ignorance concerning both the scriptures and their own Reformed histories. And along with this lack of information, they are also much less committed personally to seeking a genuine biblical faith, especially if it requires anything from them in the way of sacrifice and conflict, personally. Today, these letters are being thrown out to them by their counter-reformationist ministers to sloppily and lazily excuse themselves for being completely treasonous to their own theological heritage and counter to the scriptures in their observance of the Roman Christ Mass. Now we have these same letters, with the same arguments, that were once clearly recognized as twisted propaganda, from their twisted enemies. In George Gillespie's lengthy response to these old claims, based on the quotes from the two letters, Gillespie notes that the presentations of what these letters are actually saying has been intentionally distorted to reach the erroneous conclusions that John Calvin endorsed Christmas. And the presentation of what they say is not at all how they were intended to be read and easily understood by their original readers. And he cites several proofs taken from the text in the letters themselves. For the sake of brevity, we will highlight a few key points and not cover Gillespie's entire argument, which can be found online at www.naphtali.com/articles/George Gillespie/holydays/answers to objections/. A link to this article has been posted in the video description below for your convenience. As George Gillespie explains in his critique, the entire point of these two letters was not the denunciation of his own published positions against Roman holy days, but rather the fact that he was not the instigator of the policy in Geneva, for which these rulers were attempting to lay blame to him for. But in the very same letters, Calvin also makes clear, despite the fact he did not create the current ecclesiastical order in which they were banned, he did agree with this result. And that is the point of the letters that counter-reformationists very cleverly suppress in their skewed and dishonest presentations. As Gillespie explains in the following quote, "It is observable how both these prelates pervert Calvin's words. Bishop Spottiswoode alleges his words about the abolishing of these festival days, thus, I have been neither a persuader nor an instigator, and I wish this attested, that if the decision had been conferred upon, etc. Whereas the words in that epistle lie thus, although I have been neither a persuader nor an instigator, for it so to have happened does not, however, vex me. But if you had the condition of our church equally disclosed to you, you would not hesitate to approve of my judgment. But I wish this attested, that if the decision had been conferred upon me, etc." End quote. Gillespie points out that the counter-reformationists were actually literally slyly changing the words of the text to change the way they actually read. He goes on, quote, "The bishop would have made his hearers believe that Calvin was not content with the abolishing of the festival days, whereas his words testify the very contrary. Bishop Lindsay is as gross in perverting the end of that epistle. And yet there is no reason why men should be so provoked, if we use our liberty as the edification of the church requires, from which words he concludes that in Calvin's judgment, the observation and abrogation of those days is in the power and liberty of the church. But the reader will perceive that Calvin there speaks only of the church's liberty to abrogate holidays, and nothing of her power to observe them, for he is showing, that howbeit he durst not have given advice to abolish them, if the decision had been referred to him, yet they had no reason for them who were offended at the abolishing of them in Geneva, because that church had done no more than she had power and liberty to do for edification." End quote. The truth of the matter is that the quotes from these letters do not prove Calvin observed Christmas. What they prove is that rejecting Christmas was a consensus in the Reformation. And it was a consensus that Calvin states he is in agreement with, despite the fact he was not the author of these reforms personally. And that is why the letters were never used to contradict his own public preaching on the matter during his lifetime. The use of trickery and distortion by the Counter-Reformation with these letters is hundreds of years old. And their claims are no more true today than they were 400 years ago. But their continued use of a trick from 400 years ago should also awaken any Christian to what they are really contending with today. These are the same people. But now they are running your church. And they are now your own Presbyterian ministers. 400 years ago, they were recognized to be unregenerate, non-Christian ecclesiastical, government prelates, who were the very enemies of the gospel, and followers of the Antichrist. Today, you call them reverend. But nothing has actually really changed. Except the domain which they now rule. All the truths from the Reformation that were true, still remain true today. And all the players, who existed back then, both who followed the Antichrist, and who escaped from him, are still present today. The only question is, which one are you? The answer is found, precisely as prophesied, in how you relate to Revelation 11-10. Quote, "And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another. Because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth." End quote. If you are one of those who are greeting people with the word merry, and giving gifts to one another, in the worship of Apollyon on December 25th, and consider the truth of the witnesses to have been a torment, then you are a follower of the Antichrist, precisely as the text is prophesying. And you have been deceived by the great delusion prophesied in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And as you will see in the next video, this had a very literal fulfillment precisely in the exact time frame the text has prophesied. But first we had to show that the two witnesses actually did bring a witness. Something you would never know even happened if you listened to the followers of the Antichrist. The text also prophesies, however, that they will be defeated, precisely as they actually were. And precisely why, this is now suppressed history. The point here in this video, however, is to show there actually had been a witness. If you listen to the Counter-Reformation today posing as Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians and Evangelicals, you would think no such witness ever occurred in history. That, of course, is simply the lie they willingly and willfully tell the public. And they know it is a lie when they tell it. The consensus of the Reformation against Christmas continued for hundreds of years and continues right up into our own day. It's just that many have left the Reformation and no longer recognize it, and are deceived about it. And they now follow the Antichrist, without ever knowing that is what has been done to them, historically. In reality, when it comes to the truth about Christmas, it really doesn't matter what Luther and Calvin said or did. They were neither inspired nor infallible. They were just two men in history, like everyone else. But prophetically, it matters a great deal, whether or not they brought a witness against Christmas. Because their two names were used to reference a movement in history which later became known as the Protestant Reformation, which represented millions of Christians and theologians in history. Many of whom had come directly out of the Church of Rome itself, not only identifying the papacy as the biblical Antichrist, but Christmas itself, hopelessly entangled with the Antichrist's nature of the Vatican's papacy, rendering it in the end, despite its pleasure and pleasantries, ultimately satanic. And this is the witness from history the Counter-Reformation is desperately attempting to hide, by any means necessary, including open intentional public deceit. In this video, you saw that Counter-Reformationists routinely tried to hide the history of the Reformation's witness against Christmas, rewriting history using open intentional deceit. You saw that they did this with Martin Luther, and now in this video, how they tried to do the same kind of thing with John Calvin. They will routinely associate John Calvin with Christmas, despite the historical fact he had nothing to do with the practice. Denounced the practice, called for its abolition, and approved of it, once it had been done. Despite the fact it was the result of a grassroots theological consensus across Europe, and not his personal doing. And you saw that they will use references from two letters, in contradiction to everything that he published in writing and preached in sermons, publicly. You also saw that those two letters are contorted to justify their false claims, while ignoring everything else he said and did to the contrary. So once again, when you see the Counter-reformation, showing pictures of Luther and Christmas trees, and John Calvin with a Santa hat on, remember that you are actually looking at the fulfillment of prophecy in history. That they will celebrate the defeat of the witnesses with greetings of Mary and the giving of gifts, which is precisely what you see today. In the next video, we will finish the section on the unique witness in history, tracking the rest of the story of what John prophesied as the two witnesses, referring to the Protestant Reformation, just as he had referenced the Lollards previously, in chapter 10, with the prophetic description of the 7 voices. After you see there really had been a witness in history, precisely as had been prophesied, then we will show you how these events unfolded on the historical timeline in amazing detail and precision, to fulfill John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 verses 1 through 14. And how the two witnesses have already come and gone in history, precisely as John dated the beginning of his chapter in verses 1, 2 and 3. Thank you for watching.